My name is Isaac Davis. I'm an undergrad at Warren Wilson College, and I'm going to talk to you today about a project that I've been working on that has to do with the settlement patterns of Upper Creek Warrior Fork in Burke County, North Carolina. And before I start, I just want to make note that this is currently a work in progress. It's kind of an offshoot project of my undergrad thesis, and so which is going to be completed in April. So I don't quite have my results yet, but I've got everything, and I'll kind of show you guys what I'm doing. So first, I'm going to start out with a quick timeline of the Southeastern United States, just for all you who aren't quite as familiar with the archaeology side of it. So first, we have the Paleo-Indian period, 10,000 to 8,000 BC, and that's hunter-gatherer bands, not leaving a lot of impact on the land, but people might be familiar with Clovis points, which are that top image there. And we know that people were in the Upper Creek Warrior Fork at that time because a local resident actually found a Clovis point, not part of an archaeological investigation, but just on the ground. He found one. So there's people there at that point, 10,000 years ago at least. And then move on to the Archaic period, 8,000 to 1,000 BCE. And that's, you first start to see kind of settled areas, camps, very transient and moving, but first domesticated plants and early pottery in the Georgia coast. And then moving into the Woodland period, 1,000 BC to 1,000 CE, increasing sedentism. The villages are becoming more concentrated, staying a little bit longer, still moving around a lot, but seeing more domesticates. Maize and corn comes in right at the end of that period, and also the bow and arrow, more technology. Mississippian period follows that, and that's kind of even more increasing complexity. There's now mounds being built in palisaded villages where chief might live on top of, and maize agriculture is really important in growing a bunch. And also there's kind of a shared iconography, material culture style, so pottery styles are very similar across the Mississippian period in the southeast, different kinds of decorated shell. And these watercolors right here are kind of illustrations of what those three later different time periods might have looked like: an archaic camp, a woodland village, and a Mississippian village. So, as part of the Mississippian period, archaeologists have kind of identified individual groups based on different material culture characteristics like pottery and other iconography. And so the Burke phase is a regional Mississippian phase that occurs during the Mississippian period on the Upper Catawba and very western part of the Yadkin River. The Catawba just grazes the edge of it. I've circled it in red there, and then the Yadkin right at the top. And so that's the Burke phase, which is the main Mississippian component of the Upper Creek Warrior Fork. And a really important site within that area and within the Upper Creek Warrior Fork is the Berry site, which is the largest site in the Burke phase and the only mound site in the Upper Catawba. There's a few mounds in the Yadkin, but Berry is the only documented mound in the Upper Catawba. And very famous for being visited and occupied by the Spanish, and led by Juan Pardo in 1567, and that's where Fort San Juan was built at that time, and then later burned. And archaeological excavations have been done there since 1986. The first were led by Dave Moore, who's one of the people describing the Burke phase, and a professor at Warren Wilson. And he was working there in 86 as part of his PhD dissertation, and then founded a field school there that's been working at the Berry site since 2000, where they found the fort, in part using GPR data, similar to the Confederate prison at Salisbury, if you guys were here for that previous presentation. So this is a map of the Upper Creek Warrior Fork in my study area, and it's a tributary of the Catawba River. You can see the Catawba right at the edge of that corner there, and that's the Upper Creek Warrior Fork with Johns River right next to it. North of Morganton, and as we said before, occupation. There's been human presence there since 10,000 years ago. Today, it's mostly scattered households and developments. The floodplains are predominantly tree nurseries and shrub nurseries, and that's going to be important later. And then there's the Pisgah National Forest, Linville area up to the north, which you can kind of see on that Burke County inset map. So the data for my project comes from a systematic archaeological survey of Upper Creek Warrior Fork done by Dr. Robin Beck of Michigan in 1997. He did that as part of his master's thesis, where he identified over 40 sites, and his goals were to identify sites and then describe the settlement patterns of the Burke phase in the Upper Creek Warrior Fork, and then evaluate chieftain models. And he did that by eventually ranking the sites based on size from first, which is the largest, to fourth, the smallest, and Berry being the only first order site on the Upper Creek Warrior Fork. And an interesting part of his analysis is that he noted that third order sites often occurred in pairs, and it's hard to see on this map that he made, but across the river they would be paired third order sites, and that was an interesting part of his analysis. My project is mainly based on a study done by Dr. Eric Jones of Wake Forest, where he is also looking at settlement in the Mississippian period, but not just of Upper Creek Warrior Fork. He has a zoomed out scale to where he's looking at mostly settlements in the Yadkin, and that's the bend of the Yadkin right there. And he divides that into three different groups. One that focuses primarily on Yadkin, one he terms South Appalachian Mississippian, which Berry is one of those sites, more to the west, and then down into the southeast PD phase, Town Creek Mound, those kind of sites. And basically he's using GIS to compile a bunch of different vector layers together to then run discriminant function analysis to compare differences in settlement choice based on all those variables between different groups. And so my research objectives are to better understand the variables and decision-making process behind the settlement of Upper Creek Warrior Fork using Jones's method. I'm going to look at differences between the different time periods, Mississippian, Woodland, and Archaic, and also look at differences between the sites based on Beck's site order rank, so differences between first and second and third. And I want to compare those results to the findings that Jones had, especially with his category of Southern Appalachian Mississippian, because Upper Creek Warrior Fork would have fallen right into that category. So I want to see how different, if any, which factors for settlement come up, and also to develop a settlement ecology interpretation of the Upper Creek Warrior Fork. So my methods, I'm mainly following Jones, as I said, and he looked at not just variables of points, but also of a catchment around those points, because really if people were looking to settle, they probably wouldn't have just looked at the one specific point, they would have looked at the area around. So that's just a matter of creating a buffer around each point. And Jones used a 2-kilometer buffer, but the Upper Creek Warrior Fork is way too crowded. It's a much smaller area. It's a few miles long, where his area of study was like 200 miles. So 2 kilometers would have been kind of impractical. 1 kilometer is a little bit simpler and easier. And that's just a matter of using a symmetrical difference of the water layer and cutting it off so that, because probably people wouldn't have been crossing the river to change their settlement. And then of that catchment, that buffer zone, generate a bunch of different variables based on that. So aspect and slope, and then percent loam and percent well-drained soil of each catchment using NCRS soil survey data. And that's one issue where I ran into, because I mainly use QGIS, and the NCRS will let you look at the vector data, but to get all the tabular data, you need to download their soil viewer application, use it in ARC. So there was I had to do some transfers back and forth, but finally that worked out. Jones also looked at conifer and hardwood growth of each catchment using soils that were rated by the NCRS to be conducive to those kind of growths. But when I was looking in that Burke, the data that the NCRS provided, it wasn't very good. I'm not sure if I messed up or something, but it didn't have the information I was looking for. But we do know those tree farms are just dominating those floodplain areas. So clearly that area, I don't quite think that I need a GIS layer to tell me that it's quite conducive to tree growth. And also another factor that Jones and I will look at is wetlands and largest wetland. But that introduces a lot of uncertainty into the data because wetlands are much more fragile than soils. Soils tend to stay pretty consistent, but wetlands are much more changeable. So I'm not quite sure if I'll end up including that wetland data into my analysis. And then looking at just the point data of the sites, the aspect and slope of each site, the viewshed of each site, the visible length of the river, which is just clipping that viewshed by the UCWF. And that emerged as a really important characteristic for the South Appalachian Mississippian study done by Jones. So I want to make sure that I get that and the distance to the river. And then after I get all that data, which I'm in the process of doing, I'm going to use the discriminant function analysis to compare it to a bunch of different groups. So I can look at Burke versus non-Burke sites. I can look at all the different site order ranks using Beck's criteria. I can look at the different time periods, the Mississippian, the woodland versus archaic, all that stuff. There's a bit of an issue because a lot of these settlements didn't have one period of occupation. They were occupied variously. So even at the Berry site, it's a Burke phase site, but underneath it, when we've dug underneath it, they've found woodland period occupation. So there's multiple levels of occupation at most of these sites. And also look at categories like lithic sites versus non-lithic sites. And lithic sites is just when in the survey, all they could find was pieces of lithic, pieces of stone, flakes from arrowheads and stuff like that. So I want to compare and see if those sites, which are probably just areas where they were making arrowheads, to try and see if there's any difference in why they would select the site. And now, so I don't have my conclusions yet because, as I said, this is still kind of a work in progress. But I want to take a minute to kind of think and talk about archaeology and GIS and how they work together. Because there have been some criticisms of GIS. There's been, some archaeologists are kind of worried that GIS is aiming to replace any kind of ground truthing or traditional excavation or survey. And also a lot of archaeologists have raised the point, and geospatial focused archaeologists have raised the point that, we need to be careful because our maps are colored by our own biases and they are only representations. They're made by humans. Other archaeologists have pointed out, and this is applicable to any kind of GIS, but especially to historical data, that each layer, a modern layer might not represent what it was like in the past, and you have to be careful about what kind of uncertainty you're adding. And also some archaeologists have been concerned about environmental determinism within a settlement ecology approach through GIS. But moving forward, there's a lot of benefits to archaeology and GIS. They're both incredibly spatially focused. And also a lot of geospatial archaeologists have been kind of pushing back against a claim that GIS is looking to replace anything and are arguing that GIS should really be looked at as a way to explore, support, and extend other interpretations of archaeological sites. And that's my project. I would just like to quickly acknowledge Dr. David Abernathy of Warren Wilson, the GIS professor at Warren Wilson, for encouraging me to do this presentation. My advisor, David Moore, and Aubrey Merriweather, the archaeology lab supervisor, and also the Warren Wilson College archaeology lab and crew where I work. And those are my sources. I'll be happy to take any questions. Yes? It's pretty stable. The modern land hasn't changed so much. So Morganton is really contained underneath the Catawba River, and the development, really major development, hasn't spread above that. So all the elevation and soils and stuff should be pretty consistent from those periods. The wetlands are a whole other issue. There's different layers, and some of them have a lot more uncertainty than others do. But yeah, I'm pretty confident in most of them. Yes.
When you're looking at lithics material,
Mm-hmm.
are you segregating it by raw material type and then trying to source the raw material? For example, you have Warwick rhyolite and Ball Mountain rhyolite, and those are typically brought in through trade networks.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then you have quartz, which is ubiquitous across the Southeast. But there are certain chemical signatures, geochemical signatures provided by that you can use to almost geocode those and identify possible trade routes that if things would have been exchanged, you can find use that to also test for other village locations along those trade routes around that. So I guess my question is, have you looked at those types of raw materials and where they come from?
This project hasn't really been so much about looking at artifacts, more as like the spatial focus of them, more than like the actual content of what they are. I know there have been a lot of studies, lithic studies of geochemical sourcing of different lithic sources and stuff like that. So there's been a lot of work on that kind of stuff. But this project, I didn't really do any of that for this project. Yes.
Has anybody working in this area identified trails that might become part of the picture of where settlements go? And do you have a way to put that into your background?
So people have looked at that, and actually when Jones was looking at this, Beck and Moore, 2002, they developed a kind of initial settlement pattern when they were first kind of describing the Burke phase. And they took into account a lot of ethnohistoric accounts. So those would have been later in the Mississippian and contact period of trading paths and trails that went all throughout that region. And so part of Beck and Moore's interpretation of Burke phase settlement was a huge part of that was the location of those trails, because they were right on that path that would have led into the mountains, into the Cherokee, or down into the Piedmont. And so one of the conclusions of another study by Jones, not the 2015, but a 2017 study by Jones, because he was looking at basically site prediction at the Burke phase. And he wasn't quite able to match up with the findings of Beck and Moore and establish that. And one of his theories is that maybe that's because of the influence of those trading paths. So there's been a lot of consideration of those paths. There's not a great way to map them exactly. I mean, you can draw a line, but there's also I haven't found a great way of factoring that into that discriminant function analysis. But that would be a really interesting way to do that.
You could do some other things.
You could, and I haven't done that yet, but that would be a really interesting way to further the research and stuff like that. Great. Well, thank you so much.